My name's Sally Millard and I am going to be chairing the discussion. I'm one of the founder members of the Institute of Ideas Parents Forum. It seems that adult authority can no longer be assumed as, on the one hand, children are quite happy to come home and tell us adults off, don't smoke, don't drink, don't talk to me that way, you're making me feel bad. And on the other hand, I think adults increasingly seem to be courting the opinion of young people. This session is going to look at that question: are adults abdicating responsibility, or are children telling off the grown-ups, or is it a bit of both, I suppose? To introduce their thoughts on the issue, I have got a great panel. They have brilliant biographies and have done loads and loads of interesting things, but I'm going to let you read about them on the website. First of all, on my right is Professor Maurice Biriotti. Maurice is the Chief Executive of SHM and a founding trustee of the SHM Foundation. He's also a board member of numerous charities and Professor of Medical Humanities and Enterprise in the UCL division. He's published lots of work which covers literature, anthropology and the dynamics of cultural change. Second to speak will be Neil Davenport. Neil has organised this whole strand at the Battle of Ideas, and he writes regularly for the current affairs journal Spiked, which is the online media partner of this festival. He's written a number of articles examining the causes of and the reaction to the 2011 riots, and in addition to all that, he's head of sociology at the JFS Sixth Form Centre in Harrow. On my far left over there, Carl Emery. Carl Emery is a writer and lecturer specialising in social and emotional wellbeing and behaviour management. This is his book. It is a very interesting critique of a lot of the wellbeing discussion. Immediately to my left here, I've got KAS Quinn. She has published the prestigious Spectator magazine for 10 years. She's written for numerous newspapers and magazines, appeared on lots of programmes, Any Questions, The Politics Show, and she now writes books for older children and is writing a time travel trilogy called Chronicles of the Tempest, the second of which, The Queen at War, will be published in February 2013. She recently completed a tour of schools throughout the country and is chairing the National Literacy Trust's 20th anniversary.
I got an invitation to come to something called Telling Off the Grown-Ups. And looking at the age of some of the people in the audience, I'm now really a bit sorry that I did. I suspect I'm going to get a bit of a bashing. But anyway, I shall try and avoid that. I wanted to set the scene by talking about some work that my organisation did about the riots. And there's been a lot of talk about this. I'll try and give you a sense of what we found out, and perhaps that will provide a context for the other speakers. When the events happened a year ago in the summer, everybody got terribly worried, including me. We were all worried about what it all meant, as well as being worried about what was going on at the time. And what emerged was three different kinds of story that people started to tell about what was going on. And one kind of story was quite a strong political story. What was actually happening was that people were making a political point, that there were young people in particular saying enough is enough and we want to make a political statement. And that we, adults, had to listen to it. There was another story doing the rounds, which was that perhaps it wasn't a political point that was being made, but it was a political situation. Stuff has got pretty bad for young people, and we've allowed a situation to happen where, for some people, their experience of policing or their experience of housing or education is becoming deteriorated. And if you allow that to happen, then what do you expect? Eventually, people are going to kind of explode, and you're going to get these sorts of effects. And then there was another kind of story which had absolutely nothing to do with politics or social setting at all, which was that somehow the people getting involved in this stuff were bad, and that what they were doing was a form of evil or evil perversion of consumerism, and that what they were doing was just nicking tellies, and that there wasn't anything really behind it, and there were no particular reasons for anyone to complain about anything, and that fundamentally this was nothing to do with politics at all. And to support each of the stories, we'd have an assortment of young people who would be trotted out. So we'd get some young people who'd be trotted out, who would say yes, indeed, this is a political movement, and finally we're getting our point across. And other people who'd say, well, what do you expect? Things are really bad around here. This is what's going to happen if you allow things to deteriorate. And then there'd be shots of people who, were then had pictures taken of them in their, £2 million houses, walking out of whichever electronic store it was with a telly over their shoulder, proving that it was nothing to do with politics. When we looked at this within our organisation, we said we really need to think about it. And for some years, my colleagues who are over there, Rose Dowling and Anna Kidd and I, have been working on a project called the Political Academy. And the Political Academy is a project that we set up, which was to try and get people who are not normally engaged, young people who are not normally engaged in politics, to feel like they could get engaged. And we thought, this actually is something that the Political Academy needs to get its teeth into. And we need to ask young people themselves to give us an insight into what's going on. Which of these stories is right? What's going on here? Is this simply a kind of greed gone mad? Is it the political revolution and just the beginnings of something that's going to change our country forever? Or is it just a sense that things have got so deteriorated that ultimately we're going to get these sorts of effects unless we start to tackle social inequality, economic inequality, etc.? What emerged was that whereas, if you like, the grown-up commentators would struggle and fight amongst each other with those three stories, our young people had no such difficulty at all. It was really straightforward for them. The way in which they tackled the problem and the way in which they went about interviewing people demonstrated that, perhaps no surprise if one thinks about it for a bit, there were different motivations for different people getting involved in these events. Some people were indeed making a political point. Some people were indeed rebelling against something that they perhaps weren't able to articulate that clearly, but which had become so unbearable to them that in the end this was all they felt they could do. Some people were just jumping onto a bandwagon and behaving in ways that were criminal or perhaps undesirable in some other manner. And what we ended up with was a sense that young people themselves had a much better handle on the chaos and complexity that led to those events than perhaps the rest of us had, where what we want to do is to wrap it up into a little box where we're able to say, this is what happened and this is what our response needs to be to it. There's a danger to wrapping things up in boxes. If you tell yourself the story that this was merely a set of criminal activities, you don't listen to the fact that some people have a genuine political point to make. And that's not respectful. If you turn it all into politics, you don't listen to the fact that there was indeed some criminal activity on those rather difficult nights. And that doesn't take into account what happened to shopkeepers, what happened to members of the public who were terrified. If you turn it all into just a set of lawless activity, you don't take seriously the fact that there are real problems in our communities. And this may sound like a very simple point, but there's a serious point that underlies it, which is that the danger with the riots and the danger in the way in which we think about young people in general is that we try to make generalisations about them and that we therefore dehumanise them, turn them into a lump of people that we try and think of as one big glob, rather than saying, actually, there are real issues here, there are differences between people, and actually what we have to do is pay respect to all of the different voices. Thank you.
Well, just following from the last speaker, I would actually add a fourth dimension to that, which would be cultural changes and cultural processes, which perhaps both enable us to partly explain why the riots took place, but also perhaps why it's actually difficult to try and come up with solutions around that. I just want to start off by saying I think over the past 20 years or so, the way society, and in particular the state, views children has undergone dramatic changes. It's perhaps best summed up by one newspaper columnist recently who underlined the point that it is always important to listen to the children. And she emphasised that always important to listen to the children. And I think what this means is that listening to the children is a way of providing the authorities a vital check and a balance on adult behaviour. Now, this doesn't just mean serious allegations of abuse or even making allowances for anything like that, but increasingly it can be related to things like the diets in the family home, whether their parents recycle, whether they are damaging a child's well-being and self-esteem. And I think what tends to happen with the discussion around children is that psychological issues, such as child's well-being, gets conflated with more serious activities of violent abuse. So I think, in other words, the notion that children should be in positions to tell off the grown-ups, whether parents or teachers, or even both, has been widespread for over 20 years, and I think it's fair to say looks set to continue. So the introduction of the misnamed Children's Rights Act in 1989 shifted adult notions of natural rights, and becomes with natural rights as also being responsible for your actions, onto children who traditionally were not seen as being fully responsible for their actions, and thus creating a false equality between adults and children. I mean, this debate first emerged 20 years ago, and I remember if you dared to actually argue that there is a distinction between children and adults, you'd be dismissed as being adultist, which is a new category of the lexicon of oppressors in society. Now, I think that new legal framework of the Children's Rights Act, reflecting a cultural change in wider society, signalled a significant erosion of adult authority in the family home and in the classroom. It has long been a joke amongst teenagers that if their parents tell them off or give them a clip around the ear, they threaten to phone ChildLine or the police. And in one case, this did happen, unfortunately. I think the daughter regretted it after a teenager reported her father after he gave her a slap, resulting in the father having a police caution on his CRB. In schools as well, the authority of teachers has been drastically undermined through children's rights and the child protection industry. It's not just the issue of corporal punishment or teachers hitting children, which personally I'm not a big fan of, but rather the notion that children should be protected from psychological harm or being put under too much pressure. In other words, a child's well-being should be the locus of education rather than learning. Children and parents are very quick to report teachers if they've robustly told off or disciplined their children. Local education authorities, through the prism of child protection and children's rights, can prevent schools from expelling teenagers for not working hard enough. The then Education Secretary, Ed Balls, proposed on-the-spot fines to parents if a expelled child was discovered to be out in the public rather than at home. So even worse, I think teachers can now abdicate responsibility for teaching and expect parents to play an unpaid role in both passing on knowledge and disciplining their children as well. So taken together, we have a toxic culture of mistrust rather than old-fashioned adult solidarity, whereby both sides view the other with suspicion, resentment and loathing. Now, adults do have a duty of care towards children who they are responsible for, but the ideology and practices of child protection starts from the assumption that any adult contact represents a significant risk to child's emotional well-being. There is an assumption that adults are not savvy enough about psychological harm and the culture of respect, and that is certainly something that local education authorities are keen to promote. Secondly, the ideology of child protection has encouraged parents and teachers to view each other in a very negative and suspicious light. The widespread view that children are in danger by adults over their care means that some parents have become heightened to a sense of grievance or their child are somehow being harmed. Now, this doesn't mean that serious incidences of assault, but rather that a teacher is not taking their parents into consideration. And the same process applies to the blame the parents mantra for when a child is underperforming. My last point, I think the upshot of this is that the communal solidarity between teachers and parents has declined significantly. Consequently, the playing of one adult against another, usually on the grounds of psychological hurts or failing to pay special attention to their needs, means that young people have grown up learning not to take responsibility for their actions and behaviour. And I think it was that inability to be responsible for the behaviour, and that's part of the reasons why the riots took place.
I was going to give a very short introduction, but I feel as though I'm following a Declaration of Independence. There's a couple of points that have emerged already, and there's a danger that I'm just going to respond to what people have said rather than actually state my own position. So I'll state, first of all, that I am a lecturer and writer in children's and emotional social well-being. I work at Manchester University, and I've worked for a number of years now, particularly with young people who are disengaged from society, across many, many different aspects, but working in very, very deprived areas in Manchester. The umbrella for this discussion is the riots. And I think there's two things really that have come to me in this discussion immediately, which is, it seems to be there's two things within this room already, which is complexity and confusion. And certainly in my role as an academic focused on well-being, that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested how we've taken a term such as well-being, and in the space of probably the last 2 years has become one of the most dominant discourses in our society. And when we talk about well-being, I don't think we actually know what we're talking about. So if I asked you all now to fill in a piece of paper saying what well-being is, we'd probably come up with 50 different definitions. So we've got a really big problem right from the start here. What do we mean by well-being? Now, for me personally, I do have an opinion on this. I have a presence on this in the sense of I think that one of the difficulties, and if we bring it back to the riots, I think part of the problem for the riots comes down to this point that we have a concept of well-being in society at the moment that is a concept of, are you economically successful? And if you aren't economically successful, then you're not doing well. And that's where my interest lies, because I don't believe that. I actually believe that well-being and the well-being of our children, and I'm not sure about differentiating between our children and ourselves. I'm uncomfortable with that. We're all people. We're all human beings and we all share this planet. My position is actually that well-being is built on 3 clear elements. It's built on relationships. Nothing to do with economics, it's to do with relationships. Do we have relationships where we can share, where we are valued, and where we can be listened to? Secondly, well-being has to be subjective. As soon as government or as soon as other busybodies start telling us what we should be doing, for me personally, it makes me want to do the complete opposite. And for a lot of other people, it does as well. So it's a subjective thing. Your well-being, if you're in the valleys of Wales, is very different to your well-being if you live in Reading, I would imagine. There's all sorts of historical and cultural contexts to well-being and the subjectivity of it. And then finally, well-being is related to context. And context changes constantly. What my well-being needed 24 hours ago is somewhat different to what my well-being needs now. So again, to start just saying this is what we should be doing, this is how children should be behaving, and this is how adults should be behaving, is naive. I'll give you a couple of examples. The first one is, I've written a quote down here from Brave New World, which I think is a fabulous book, and I'd imagine many of you in here have read it, and I say go back and read it again. I'll give you a quote from it. That is the secret of happiness and virtue, liking what you've got to do. And I think one of the problems that we have in society at the moment is we're very, very confused, and many of us are very unhappy with what we have to do. We aren't comfortable morally, we aren't comfortably ethically in many instances. And that leaves us, particularly as adults, with a very, very difficult situation. So we tell our children we love and care about them, and then we stick cameras everywhere we can. What does that do? What does that create? What does that tell our children? We create a society whereby more time and more interest is spent on the economic value of things than just listening to people or just being able to be. And I think that creates great confusion in our children. I'll finish on that point because I'll probably have much more to say as the debate goes on. I will show you something that, for me, is where we're heading and really, really concerns me. And this is what I think I'm trying to challenge, really. I'm worried that the psychological complexity of people is no longer allowed in modern society. And if we're not careful, this is what we're all going to look like. Because I think that is what people in society want us to do. They want us all to look like that. Because if we all look like that, then we're not complaining about there's no new roads. We're not complaining about housing. We're not complaining about education because we're all, I'm okay.
I want to be a great coward, and I want to begin with a disclaimer. I have no educational background in sociology or psychology, and also everything I think I've realized is terribly colored by my background. I am middle-aged. I am middle class. I am a white woman with 2 children. How many people in this audience actually have children? Do you want to raise your hand? That's okay, good, okay. And the rest of you, good luck if it's coming to you. My 2 children are not teenagers, so we have yet to hit the rocks, so to speak, and what is often difficult in raising children. I think because of my background, I was puzzled by this entire topic. Are adults in charge of the children? Well, yes, the adults are in charge of the children. The majority of parents, I believe, choose to have children. Not all, but the majority of parents choose to have children. It's an enormous emotional tie, and it's also a social contract. It's the kind of social contract that we used to associate with marriage. This is how it should be. The way it should be is you should wake up in the morning, and if you're a student, you should go to class. If you are going to work, you should go to work. If you're a parent, you should raise your children. I think you also have a responsibility to look after your own parents as they get older. It's a whole circle, a family circle. It's the parental unit. And of course, that's how it should be. You should have parental authority. Now, there has been a lot of talk about state and interference of the state in parental authority, and I'm completely confused by this concept of the state. It's a kind of collective noun. By the state, I assume, as a foreigner, that what you mean is the elected government as it is supported by the thousands of public employees who work within the state system. So are they, in this context, responsible for bringing up children? No. No, the state isn't responsible for bringing up your children. Are they there to help? Yes, I think the state is there to help you bring up your children. When messages come from on high about not smoking or losing weight or eating 5 fruit or veg a day, it's not that the state has been up all night reading, and it's funny, I thought of this too, 1984. It's no one is hankering after the role of Big Brother. I believe it's because in some department, somewhere, someone has done a lot of research, and they've come to the conclusion that fewer cigarettes and more vegetables, well, they will help people to be healthier and happier. And the elected government wants votes. They're just not that different from Procter and Gamble. You know, they want you to buy their product. They want you to vote for you. So they're trying to promote your greater sense of well-being. And by well-being, I mean health and happiness. I don't mean material goods per se. And the information the government gives you, I think that's a good thing. I mean, I'm glad to know about car seats. I'm glad to know about secondary smoke. And I'm glad to know that marijuana today is much stronger than it was in the 1980s. You know, this is good information to have. And this is information the state provides. And they're tools that are helping me to raise my children. I don't think this diminishes my authority in any possible way. I think it gives me knowledge, and I think it gives me knowledge that makes me a better parent. I work for the National Literacy Trust, and the aim of this organization is to make certain that children in Britain are able to read and write on a level where they can function and contribute to society. And the hope is that by enhancing someone's communication abilities, they'll have ways to express themselves and ways to voice their opinions. So yes, we step in. In fact, the word they use, which frightened me at first, the word is intervention, which I found rather strange. But intervention is a good thing in this organization because, for example, in the poorest communities in this country, we train volunteers from that community to work one-on-one with parents and to show them how to teach their own children. And it's humbling to see these parents. They are, many of them, young. Often they're a single parent, and for many of them, English is a second language. And the program strengthens not just their child's literary skills, it strengthens their literary skills. It's positive for both, usually the mother, and always the child. And this outside intervention reinforces the adult's authority. The mother's better able to help her child. The child learns to read and write. An additional positive side effect comes to the community volunteer who helps them. Many of the community volunteers have told us they have an added value within their community, like the nurse at an NHS centre, like a preacher in a mosque or a church, that it gives all three of the people involved value. And this is value that does come from state intervention. It all relates back to actually Maurice's SHM Foundation, his youth-led investigation. And to quote from that report, many of the people who took part in the riots do not have the tools or the knowledge to deal with their issues in other ways. And the National Literacy Trust helps provide these tools. So if this is intrusiveness, I must be a big fan of the intrusive. I don't think, as no one here does, that you gain authority by hitting a child or shouting, though 7 p.m. tomorrow night there will probably be a bit of shouting in my house. I'm sorry about that. I think the thing that swings the balance between a parent and child is maturity and experience and knowledge. And this sounds very much like a Big Brother political slogan, but knowledge does give you power. And it also gives you confidence, because you do have to negotiate with your children. You do have to communicate with your children. And you have to take their opinions into account. But you also have to know enough to disagree with them and to, on occasion, discipline them. And that comes from information. And this is an extremely edgy balancing act when you're bringing up children. And I do get lots of help. I get help from my husband and from my own mother, and I get help from the state. And I can't resent the state or my mother or my husband, because I know they're simply trying to help me.
I suppose one of the questions that I have is, there seems to be a lot of discussion about listening on the panel amongst the introductions. So on the one hand, Neil seems to imply adults are told too much, to listen too much, and we're listening too much to the young people and to children. Maurice says that we as adults are very often projecting our views as adults onto young people and perhaps not listening enough. And then Carl also talked a lot about well-being and what does well-being mean, and shouldn't that be more about actually listening to young people and children rather than imposing a kind of so-called objective view, I think you say, onto a kind of adult's view, you could say, onto children in terms of what well-being is. Kay, you seem to be saying we should be listening more to authority maybe, or that listening to authority can be a good thing because it can give us lots of information that we wouldn't otherwise have. So I just maybe think it might be useful if we could say a bit more maybe about what does that mean. Should we be listening to children, or should children be listening to adults?
When we're talking about well-being and we're talking about children in society today, a couple of years ago the Department for Education did a research study on what was meant by well-being and what did young people want. Very interesting piece of work. They did it about 6 years ago. The report went over to Leeds, Manchester and London and sat down with families and with children and said, what does well-being mean to you? The first response was none of the people had a clue what they were talking about. They said, well, what do you mean by well-being? We don't know what you mean. So the state had to define what they meant by well-being. That's quite an interesting point alone. However, when they did define it, the evidence that came back was very, very clear. Children said, what we want is space. We want unregulated playtime. We want you to stop watching us all the time, and we want to be able to go out and wander. Now, that's what children said they wanted. So what we do generally in response to that is sell off more school playing fields, put up more video cameras, and watch them ever more. So we've got this dilemma, this kind of dichotomy, in the sense that we might listen, but just because you listen doesn't mean you understand. And I think there's a real crux there. We will often listen to what we want to hear, but whether we actually hear what young people say and what children say, and also what we're going to do if what we hear challenges us as adults. So if young people turn around and say, well, actually, what I want you to hear is you've made an absolute mess of society, what do we do then? Do we go, yes, we have, and how can we rectify this, and what can we do? Or do we go, how dare you say things like that? I'm the adult. So if we're going to engage in a conversation, we've got to engage in it in a certain manner. And I would argue that it's got to be an authentic conversation. You can't start asking questions and listening unless you're, first of all, willing to hear the answers, and then secondly, willing to engage with the answers.
I think most parents do have authentic conversations. I don't know, what's the opposite of an inauthentic conversation, an artificial conversation?
Yeah, I think there's lots of inauthentic conversations. I think there's lots of inauthentic conversations that go along the lines of, why don't you leave us alone and go and play upstairs for a couple of hours? And the child maybe wants to talk. I think there's lots of inauthentic conversations that are put across on the media, whereby we are told stories of children and what children do that aren't true.
Okay. Well, it seems to me that almost most parents, when they start being parents, are trying to do the right thing. There are very few parents who set out thinking, I want to be a bad parent, I'm going to be very selfish, I'm not going to listen to my children. And I think as a parent, you do try and listen to what your children are saying. If my children said to me, you've made a mess of things, I'd ask, what particular bits of the mess are the worst, and then we would go through it. I mean, for instance, on the subject of the environment, there's been a lot of discussion on the environment. I've discussed with them the use of fossil fuels, industrialization, how this works, and where we're rectifying it, and where sometimes we're too selfish to rectify it. So
I think that was an important distinction to make. My point was it was the state doesn't listen, not the individual parents don't listen.
Well, I think the state is trying to listen. I think that all of the information the state is shooting down to us is based on the fact that they are listening and they're trying to help. I think most of it is based on research that they're doing in different government institutions.
Well, just on that, I'm all in favour of an intergenerational dialogue, which is actually not taking place in society at the moment. I think what is tending to happen is that it's listening to the children. I think it takes the assumption in particular cases that children are on the same playing field as an adult, and it's not, it's not the case. Obviously, in many instances, children are not in that capability of making that same, informed decision that an adult would make. But the intergenerational dialogue is about that process of bringing young people on side so they do become, autonomous individuals who are capable of making those choices. What tends to happen is that in every step of the way, I'm intrigued by what you're saying, what do we mean by the state? I suppose it's like sort of caring agencies or protection agencies who are actually preventing that dialogue between adults and children from taking place. And it's more of a case of children are like a glove puppet through which adults are regulated. And I think that's the point I would get across. I think listening to the children in terms of bringing children on is a different thing from listening to children in order to actually undermine how adults bring up their children, how teachers teach, is a very different matter.
Maybe one of the reasons why this becomes so knotty is that listen to has, I can think of 3 completely different meanings that we're using around this panel. But listen to can mean obey. If I say listen to me, that sometimes means do as I say. Listen to can mean take account of something, so I'll listen to the advice. And listen to can mean understand people. And I think possibly we're all talking about it in slightly different ways. Yeah. The listen to that I was talking about was whether people had, the people who were thinking about, for example, a phenomenon like the riots, were looking at the evidence without trying to project onto the evidence things that they had already decided was the way society was. But that's somewhat different from the degree to which young people should or shouldn't listen to their parents, which I'm not going to comment on because I'm not a parent, which is different again from the degree to which we should or shouldn't take account of advice that we get from the state, and they are quite different things.
I think it's a fascinating discussion. I've got a couple of observations. The first is that in some senses I'm not sure how helpful it is to frame this debate about the riots, because it seems to me in its own right completely riveting to talk about the relationship between children and adults and parenting. The riots, however, were economic, and it seems to me that the issue that pervades the whole of the relationship between children and adults in society is also economic, which is that parents are working all the time, really, really hard, and they don't have a lot of time to listen, as you put it so well, authentically. And so I wonder what the panel think about how you recreate that intimacy and that connection, that family life when families are not complete, because that seems to me the underpinning. So I guess my question is, do we agree that somehow the absence of enough family is a problem? And how can the state or any other institutions somehow compensate or replicate for that fundamental institution?
I just want to make an observation about the discourse of well-being, and link it back to the riots, but it's not entirely coming out of the riots. I think that we're going to see a big shift in the discourse towards character building and character development, and if you want to discuss that, my session tomorrow is on that theme. But the serious point is that I think the last government talked a lot about emotional well-being. I think we are going to see a shift in that towards character building and character development in schools. But that will be framed in the same way that emotional well-being was, i.e. it's a set of psychological skills that can be trained, that children can learn, that families may or may not be capable of doing, just as families were seen as not being capable of developing children's emotional well-being. And I think that that is a significant shift that we're about to see towards character. That's an observation. I've got two questions, and they're linked. What I observe, I'm not a parent, but I don't see that that disqualifies me from commenting. But what I do see in the families that I know, which are predominantly middle-class families, I see it in the university students that I teach, and I see it amongst my colleagues who are school teachers, is adults becoming less and less confident in how to deal with children and young people. I sit in so many dinner parties and situations now where the parents are completely anxiety-stricken about everything that's going on with their children and not sure what to do about it. And the thing that I also observe is that we're becoming in schools and universities, I can see this, I work in a very good university, a growing casual disrespect for adults and for what adults have to say. And I don't know whether the two are linked, but I see both phenomena, and I want to know whether the panel sees those same phenomena as well.
I was just interested in Carl saying, if we do listen to children, the thing we hear is they want unregulated space, and I think there is a real truth to that. But actually, I feel that listening authentically sounds to me a trend that is against that, and it does seem to be this sort of situation where parents and children are locked in this thing when parents have to know everything that is happening in the child's life. And, you know, Kay actually said, well, the social contract now with child and mother is like what marriage used to be. And that sounds to me unhealthy. And I wonder, you know, isn't adult authority, isn't your thing about a parent saying, you go away and play for 2 hours and I have my life and you have yours, based on a trust and an independence, and that authority gives them that space. And an example I always look is parents concerned around Facebook. You know, when their child is old enough to go to, you know, my child can go on Facebook. I say, I trust you, don't get into whatever, but otherwise I'm not going to stalk you through Facebook. But so many parents are so worried, and they go, oh yes, I trust my child, but I will still follow them around the web, for example. And so I distrust listening authentically in that sense.
I think almost every generation has its own sort of moral panic about the younger generation, and we've seen this at various times throughout the 20th century, and I think we're seeing the latest incarnation at the moment. I'm not trying to defend the riots at all. I think that is a separate, well, it's a related issue, but it's a separate issue. And a second point is, I think we need a distinction between children and teenagers. Yeah. So parents seem to, I'm sure this is not true of all parents, but some parents do seem to dismiss things that teenagers say as kind of hormonal ravings and it being just a phase, any opinions they may have. And I think that teenagers' opinions do need to be taken separately, taken seriously, because they are kind of almost adults. They're close to adulthood, and I think we should listen to them a lot more.
I have a background as a head teacher, amongst other things, and I'm a writer now. I'm interested in the relationship between parents and children and what's expected of parents. This was brought home to me once when I took a boy home on a Friday night. He was about to be expelled from the school where I was deputy head, and he had been left in a children's home and seen his older siblings gone off into comfortable adoption. He knew he was going to be thrown out of the school, and he was distraught. I took him to the home and asked to see the adult who was responsible for him, the public servant who was responsible for him. And that person was on holiday for the weekend. And there was nobody else who could be called to listen to this boy's fate and to know over the weekend he was waiting to be expelled from the school. And I think for me that highlighted the fact that parents are in a unique situation, having created children. There is nobody else they can dump their children on legitimately. And sometimes in our expectations of parents, we forget that. Everybody else is entitled to resign from the job looking after troublesome children, or to go on leave, or have a nervous breakdown. But parents can't. And I do think that, yes, there are a minority of parents who merit intervention, perhaps earlier than we do now. But we should also remember that when we intrude on their responsibilities, we can walk away from it in a way that they can't.
And my perspective is that I help to run an educational charity in an exceptionally disadvantaged area, and I get to talk to parents about all sorts of things. And first of all, I'd just like to make a remark that when I beheld the riots, my comment was it's a fiesta of criminality. And for people to go around saying, well, it's for economic reasons or social reasons or whatever, sorry, it's no excuse. It was criminality. It was criminality. Let's not get away from it. And that's a moral issue. Now, as far as the parents I come into contact with, we have a great deal. Actually, they didn't go out and riot, our lot of children. They didn't do that, but perhaps they were being very busy in their postcode gangs, of knifing each other, shooting each other. This sort of thing happens quite commonly in the area where I work. And in fact, parents are very, very worried about it. Many of them are not educated themselves. They find it very difficult to do what middle-class parents do, which is to have conversations with their children. Literally, many parents don't know how to have a conversation with their children. Now, that doesn't make them any less responsible as parents or feeling that they have responsibility as parents. But it means that the tactics they have at their disposal are very limited. And I think the one big thing that has really inhibited parents in controlling their children is actually that they no longer feel that they have the right to smack their children. Now, I don't know, maybe I'll get feelings of shock around this room. What a shocking idea that maybe parents should smack their children. But I'm afraid that traditionally this has been a way in which parents have controlled their children. And frankly, they can't have arguments with them. Many of them are going on parenting courses, which actually has some quite funny outcomes. I see parents marching along the road with their children and suddenly turning on their children and saying, "Good listening, Joshua," or something like that, because they've been told that what they've got to do is praise their children simply for conforming. Now, I think we have to ask ourselves again, what is likely to be the outcome of this? Whether children will always expect to be praised and rewarded every time they merely don't offend, if you like. I think perhaps we are reaching that point. But it's very difficult for these parents. Some of them got charts up on their walls, giving their children stars for the fact that they've been listening or something like that. It's very, very difficult for parents at the moment. And I think parents should be given freedom by the government to bring up their children as they wish, short, obviously, of neglect, cruelty, and all the rest of it. All those things should be forbidden, and at those points, we should intervene. But otherwise, for goodness sake, let's give parents the chance, and let's give them backing.
Are there disrespectful young people? Yes. Do I come across disrespectful young people? Yes. Was I disrespectful when I was young? Yes. Were people I used to hang out with disrespectful when they were young? Yes. Is this new? No. Do I also see a lot of very disrespectful adults talking about young people as if they were all some kind of uncontrollable mob? Yes. I think that the question of respect is something that goes both ways. Do I think that there are young people who ought not simply to be praised when they do something that's common courtesy? Yes, I do. I do think that's right. I don't think one should smack people. It doesn't seem to me that smacking people of any age is a good idea. But do I believe that we ought to be able to tell each other when we find each other's behaviour offensive, whatever age we are? Yes, I do. Do I think this has to be reduced to a generational war? Absolutely not. The reason why we should respect people is because we're people, not because of the age we are.
Just on that, I mean, I don't want a generational war either. I mean, it goes back to that early point that we need intergenerational kind of understanding and dialogue, and I think many of the solutions that put forward after the riots or the cultural changes that have led up to that have actually skewed and distorted that very organic and that very important process. I do want to talk about the riots because obviously this is part of the riot strand, and I just want to explain what the links are. I suppose it goes back to what Carl was saying about well-being, because I think another word for well-being is self-esteem, and I think that's what young people internalise. And the idea of self-esteem, what it actually means is a sort of contentment, but what it also means is not being disappointed. And it's the idea that young people should be protected from disappointment at all costs. So we get situations whereby good teaching practice is not to do, ask a question and raise hands in case those who are shy about speaking, in case it damages their self-esteem. So the education system is about protecting young people in that sense. And I think what follows from there is the sense that your self-esteem is more important than anything else, and satisfying your individual psychological self-esteem takes priority over other individuals. And the problem with that is that it undermines social solidarity, because the traditional organic way of raising children is that it's about getting them to think outside of themselves, to think of other people and to identify with others in terms of the common good. The therapeutic idea of self-esteem completely smashes that, and it completely destroys it. I mean, it's true, young people have always been disrespectful, but I think what's changing, what's new, is the expectation not to be told off. And I think what happened with the riots, if you look at a lot of the explanations, is, well, I decided to torch curries or loot curries because they didn't give me a job. And it's that sense of grievance, that bitterness that has been, nurtured within an education system whereby young people are expected to have their every needs met. And when they haven't, it fosters this very sort of bitter grievance. So I think that's what's new in the past. If you challenge an authority, you'd accept, what would happen. You knew what the consequences were. That's what's different. And I think how young people responded to the riots after, they were completely shocked. And I just got the impression that was probably the first time they'd ever been told off. And so I think that's the connections really with underpinning looking at the issue of self-esteem, well-being, and how it led to that peculiar behaviour in August last year.
First of all, I'd like to say I like a sense of grievance. I like rebellion. I like anger. I like mess. I like protest. And I think part of the problem we're experiencing at the moment, and I wonder whether, when I said authentic before, let me be very clear what I mean by that, because the point you made is very, very well put. By authentic, I mean we have conversations where we are truthful with children about where we are and what we're doing. And I think often we don't do that. So, for instance, in terms of the society we currently operate in, the individual is king. Now, we cannot begin to pretend that's not true. We have created a society where everything is personalised, where economic value is placed on every activity, and if it doesn't have an economic value, it isn't valuable. Yet we don't, I believe, particularly openly tell our children that is what's going on. So therefore, we completely and utterly baffle and confuse them a lot of the time. I mean, in terms of some of the points made, around character building, absolutely. No, there's absolutely no doubt that this current coalition government is moving towards a model of character building that is very much based on this idea of a lean, fit individual who can operate in a modern, contemporary, neoliberal society. That's what we want to see. It's not what I want to see, but that's what certain people want to see. But what happens if you don't fit into that? It's no good being told to pull your socks up if you haven't got any socks. You can't keep on doing it. How far down the line do we have to go till we suddenly realise actually that we've incredibly damaged maybe 2/3 of the population? To what point do we have to reach where people are saying, this isn't working, I need more than this, I need to be heard, I need to be able to do something more than this? And the questions I think that we still haven't answered. Final point, I don't think you can divorce this from economics. I think there's an absolute, again, this is about authentic conversations, I think there's an absolute economic foundation to this conversation, which is if you are a parent, single or not, I'm a single parent myself, I don't think it makes that much difference actually. I think just being a parent, the economic demands on your time to provide for your family and for all those things that come with that place so much pressure on adults that it's virtually almost impossible to have that authentic time or that authentic conversation. We talk about building schools that are going to stay open until 8 o'clock in the evening. Why do we want to do that? Surely we want to be at home with our children, spending that time with them. Yet, as a society, somehow we have this confused conversation whereby we go, you should spend more time with your children, but we'll keep schools open till 8 o'clock in the evening. Well, what do you want? And that is where the problem, I feel, lies. It's in this complete confusion and contradictions in adult conversation.
I wanted to say how much I agreed with the former headmaster who talked about the how difficult it is for a parent to walk away, that it's the final person who finds it difficult to walk away from a child. And I think that's really what I meant by a social contract with children, that you are bound to them through the state or through God or through whatever way, and to do your best. And I think that's really what I meant when I talked about a social contract. Now, are parents becoming less confident? I'm not sure. And are parents becoming more fearful? I don't think so. I think parents have always lacked confidence in a certain way, and I think parents have always feared. I recently read a letter written in the 18th century, the beginning of the 18th century, and the woman was writing to her sister, and she said, "I'm holding the baby, and I'm looking at the baby, because I'm afraid if I stop looking at the baby will die." You know, so hundreds of years can go by, but I think parents still maintain a certain amount of fear in raising their children, and not just physical well-being. I think emotional and mental well-being. I made a list to myself the other night. What do I fear most? One of the things I fear for my children is education, and it could be because I come from a Jewish immigrant background, and we believe that education is the rucksack you carry on your back. It is the thing that moves you through life, and not necessarily for economic well-being. It moves you through your life for self-knowledge, self-reliance. I think the point of education is that you're not bored when you're alone. And the point of education is I can meet someone like Carl who believes very different things from me and go home and read and read and read him and come to understand what he's saying and often embrace it. So I fear for education and the level of education. And that's why, as Sally talks about in her blogs, when the school says you have to do 2 hours of homework with your child, I do it. And I do it because I'm scared shitless that my children are not going to know enough. Is this good? I don't know. That's the way it is. I think, what else do I fear? I fear communication. I fear the concept personally, not state, of authentic communication. I fear that if I don't speak to my children truthfully and honestly, if I don't make the time, they'll just go underground and they'll stop talking to me. And I know that technology is a bit of a chestnut and not always the thing you should bring up here, but I fear they're going to go online and do something really, really bad because I'm older and I don't understand technology in the same way they do. You know, there are a million other things that I fear for them. I fear for their health. I fear that they won't respect people. And all I can do is say to them, please shake their hand, please look them in the eye, thinking if I teach them the titular habits, that the rest of it will come with it. And then I wake up in the night and I think, have I really taught them why you should respect people, or am I just teaching them lip service? So I think that, no, I think that parents are not as confident. I'm sure there are millions of more confident parents in this room. But I think it's a long-standing thing. And I do stand by my belief that if you read the information that often the state provides, it's there to help. You have to make your own decisions, and you can often reject what the state or the government is saying to you. And yes, I let my children ride in the front seat occasionally. It is a treat, and if they get killed, I will kill myself. But I think it is good to have the information when it's there.
One of the problems that I find from a teenage point of view is the differentiation between children, teenagers, young adults, and beyond, because obviously you can't listen too closely to what a 6-year-old is telling you you've got to do. But once, and even within the teenage years, when you're 13, you don't know half as much, you know, when you're 16 or 17 or 18. But then when you turn 18, you don't immediately gain maturity either. So we've got to be aware that when you are a young adult, you're not as aware of certain things as you are when you're 30 or 40 or getting on beyond. But
thanks.
As I said, from a teenage point of view, often I'll get treated like I am younger than I am simply because I am under 18. And I can see people treating 18-year-olds with slightly more respect than they may deserve from a personal point of view. And it does seem to be one of the problems that we face every single day, and one of the reasons we do get quite so annoyed with adults.
And if I look at the difference between the primary education I had when I was 10 and the ones me brother and sister are having now, in their primary education, they're not told like no or what's wrong. This ties back into university education as well. When you're in university, you're not even told what's right and wrong. Then even the lecturer, the academic, doesn't have any kind of like authority over you because it's tied into all these postmodern concepts of character building and what's right and what's wrong, what's authority. No one actually knows. And also what this young girl will find when she gets to university is, even then, you're not an adult. You're still treated as a child. And my department, my sociology department at Sheffield, keeps growing and growing its administration and support roles and everything, because apparently at the age of 21, I'm not old enough to take care of myself. So I think there's going to be an even bigger problem for people of my generation when they have children, whether they're going to be able to do it. Because, I mean, you've got no actual kind of confidence in what any of us can actually do.
A couple of points. I really agree with that. That point, but also children are not adults. Teenagers are not adults. By their very nature, they are not adults. And from my point of view as a parent and an adult, I may or may not respect their views. I may or may not care if they're offended by my views, as it happens. If the point about an expectation not to be told off, well, I'm sorry, if I offend you because I'm going to be authoritative in my role as a parent or an adult, then actually I don't care about that, because that is my responsibility as an adult to be authoritative. The other point I wanted to make, one of the panellists earlier said something about we're not listening to what children say, and what if they said that we've messed up the world? What do we do about that then? If they say, you've destroyed things for us going forward. Well, I think the state actually has listened to a lot of that, and I think you'll find in lots of educational policy now it's very, very apologetic to the young people, and very kind of trying to put into place all sorts of policies for young people around training, about how, which is all about the social mobility agenda, but trying to apologise for what we've done as adults without any authority as adults. So I think that we have listened, and actually but there aren't any solutions, because nobody's got any ideas what to do about it anyway.
We heard about wellbeing and how so much wellbeing for young people is about relationships with adults, be it parents or teachers or other people in the community. And Kay, you mentioned a few times that the state is, in your perspective, playing quite a positive role in supporting you as a parent. But I'm a bit not sure about that. I'm not sure how high up the agenda supporting relationships between children and adults is. Just look at the closure of Sure Start centres, the falling numbers of teaching assistants in classrooms. So it seems like there's a long way to go. So I want to open it to the panel and ask them, do you think there's a role for the state to play here in supporting these relationships? And if so, what do you think they should do?
Hi there. Just focusing on children rather than teenagers. And I'm just wondered what the panel thought about the role of tradition, because I'm increasingly finding myself, like Kay, as what did you call it, a professional Victorian. I don't have children myself, but it seems to me that most of the people that I know that do have children seem to be escaping the state. They're all pretending to be Catholic and going to Catholic schools. They're all trying to frantically save money to send their kids to independent schools. Certain schools able to achieve, like the JFS, achieve great results, sticking to a traditional way of doing things. And it seems to me that if you go out to the general population, that is something that most people understand, that's something that's real in terms of their choices about education. Escaping control of the state, not totally, but to an environment where tradition still plays a part and informs how children are taught, particularly in education. So I'm wondering on the balance between tradition and not tradition, because I find myself, as somebody who likes to think of himself as not a traditionalist, increasingly reaching back and looking at tradition as something which we should perhaps sing more highly and think more highly of.
Yeah, it's a question mainly for KAS Quinn. I was quite fascinated by your opening remarks. I didn't agree with what you said, but I was quite fascinated by them. And the reason I was fascinated was that it's rare to hear such a very sort of clear, uncluttered view of the relationship between state advice and parents' well-being. So, I mean, basically what you presented was that, somebody in the government goes away and reads all the research papers, distills the advice that we need to know, gives it to us, and then that allows you and me to function better and to be better parents. And I was kind of listening to that, and I was thinking, wow, wouldn't that actually be nice if I believed that, and I really felt that there was that level of neutrality in state information and advice. I could just lap it up and listen to it and act on it. And I suppose my question, which is really a very genuine question, is do you actually believe that? I mean, do you not see any role of the government being swayed by interest groups or lobbyists or having hidden motivations or subtle agendas or, trying to kind of respond to panics among the population or perhaps displace social problems onto the family.
I don't believe in the notion of children telling off the parents. I rather think that instead of it just being between families and just parents and children alone, I think that everyone collectively, adults and grown-ups and children, teenagers, should all get to understand each other more, because through understanding we can, go further and know what to do then. I think what the state is doing is good because they're giving initiatives to children and to adults as to what each other wants. So, as soon as we understand what each other wants, then we can then build up from there and, get a more supportive group for everything. And I think that's one main reason why the London riots happened, because we don't understand each other enough yet. I don't think parents or adults generally, not saying anything wrong or whatever, but I don't think they understand what teenagers want, and I don't think teenagers understand what role parents and adults have been given, so that they can, then show teenagers the ropes. I mean, parents are parents because they're there to show younger children, younger people, how to then become parents, to, continue this cycle. So I think if we have more initiatives into understanding and stuff, I think it'll be better for everyone.
Hi. You mentioned, in talking about who has the power in the relationship between children, you've also mentioned as the other side of this being the parent or being the teacher or being the adult or being the authority. And I just want to highlight that they're all very different things in very different areas. And I've found personally that this diverse range of inputs has been everything from hugely constructive to really annoying to actually really, really, for not myself but for other people, have been really, really negative force on knowing what is right at the end of the day and maturing into an adult yourself. And I was just wondering, with this incoherency, who should have the power? And there's very little attempt to, at the moment I think, less so than there was, to have a coherency between all of these different inputs. What would you say should be done about that?
Okay, I just want to respond to the issue about tradition. I'd argue a key aspect of tradition is the idea of passing on the learning of one generation to the next generation. That's always been a very important part of tradition. And I think that why that is important, if you think about knowledge itself should have that authority, and it's transmitted by adults who've got that knowledge and that authority and that knowledge as well. And I think the great thing about that process of passing on that knowledge to the next generation is that if we can be specific, you enable teenagers to start imagining things outside of themselves, which I don't think the self-esteem thing does the opposite. It forces young people to be preoccupied with themselves, whereas passing on that knowledge is about engaging young people with a wider debate and taking them outside of themselves. And in terms of this listening, I mean, as a teacher, I actually like it when a student will say what you're talking about it's rubbish, or it doesn't make sense, or I don't agree with that idea. And I think that does happen in faith schools where kids will, what are you on about? And that kind of cheek or that kind of response to adults is good, because you're actually engaging with ideas and you're actually kind of challenging ideas. And also in that process brings on side young people, because they can feel, because it's like a gateway to adulthood, and it's been part of society rather than the navel gazing. Am I feeling happy? Am I miserable? That is promoted in other areas of education, and I'm convinced that's why faith schools tend to do very well in education. I agree with what the teenager over here said about the other problem as well, of course, is infantilising teenagers, whereby I think what has to happen is that there should be a culture of freedom. Young people should be allowed to make mistakes. They should be allowed to make bad decisions, because that's all that process of growing up. To be morally autonomous, it's not, you're right about the rebellion side, but it's about that freedom to make those mistakes and to become independent. And I think that's what's not happening at the moment. That process of trying to make sure that young people's esteem and that young people's well-being is satisfied is actually a form of infantilising young people and not taking them forward into adult society.
couple of really interesting themes emerged, and there's two themes I guess I want to look at there, and they are tradition and power. And I thought there were some very interesting questions there. In terms of tradition, tradition is important in society, and it has a very, very interesting role to play. But tradition is about generally reinforcing to ensure that those who are in positions of power stay in positions of power. Tradition is a very useful tool also for compliance as well. And that worries me a little bit. I think lots of the people you're talking about have the economic access to opt out of the state. I think the vast majority of us don't have the economic access to opt out of the state. So we don't have that power. We have to play with what we have. We can't make the choice to leave or to stay. That concerns me. I know the figures in London are really quite high for the people who turn to opt out of that state role. That kind of whole issue of power takes us into the question that you raised, really, about, you know, we're given these materials, we're given this information, and it isn't neutral. It absolutely isn't neutral. It is politicised information. There's a little thing that you can maybe take away from today in terms of next time you read a speech on well-being, on what we should be doing to children, or what we should be doing as adults, instead of reading the term well-being, substitute compliancy for it and see how it reads. And I tell you now, it's a very, very interesting substitute to use, because certainly one of my concerns, and we haven't really touched upon it very much on the panel today, is actually the problem is that we are trying to make young people homogenous. We're trying to create a compliant, homogenous group of young people who will do as they are told and act in a certain way. And I bring you back to the smiley face. When actually life is about mess quite often. Life is about uncertainty. Life is about complexity. And I think we lose that by constantly trying to distill things into very, very simplistic answers.
Do I believe? Yes, I do. In 5 minutes, I do believe that on the whole, the information that the state's trying to give you to raise your children, they are trying to be positive. Do I think there's any such thing as neutral information? No. I think there is no such thing as neutral information. Not even in the purity of numbers do you find neutral information. The other thing I think to remember is, where do we get our information from? Mostly from the media. I spent years working in the media, and I can tell you there's no newspaper that doesn't have a huge tank of an opinion they're trying to put on your lawn at all times. So no, information is not neutral. But when you say who's in charge, the grown-ups or the children, I think the grown-ups are in charge, and one of your duties as being the grown-up is to be intelligent enough to sift through the information, to see what they're trying to get you to do, and see what you believe in it. And once you've made that separation of the wheat from the chaff, take the information and move forward. The other thing is, to be very cynical, is I knew what Neil was going to say, and I thought maybe I knew where you were going to go, so I thought I might balance it in the other direction, though I did believe what I said, I do promise you that. On the subject of teenagers, you're such an articulate young person. If they were all like you, we would not give you any grief. But when I write basically about slightly younger than teenagers. And I write different kinds of family units. In one family unit, it's a single mother. She's an aging pop star. And it's one of those family units where the child is the adult. And you all know families like that, where they end up with some incredible, wonderful grown-up. And yes, that is a family where the child is treated with great respect and is an adult. In another child, in one of my books, is not an adult in any possible way, because her mother is Queen Victoria. And when your mother is the Queen of England and the Emperor of India, you don't get a lot of voice. So I think it does depend on the individual. And finally, on the subject of tradition, I want to say the thing that has not come up today, which is so interesting, is no one ever does who's an authority, who do you depend on, who do you listen to. No one talks about God anymore. There's kind of no God. There's no religion. And I find that so interesting, that when it comes to the subject of authority, no one ever relaxes into the concept of a higher authority.
I guess my overriding sense of this conversation is something that frightens me a little bit, which is that there are different sides to this debate, and that the different sides to the debate can very easily exaggerate from the worst examples to the whole of society. So we find a young person who's disrespectful, and we say respect is dead. We find parents who can't cope, and we say no parents can cope. We find older people who completely disrespect the young, and we say there is a complete disrespect amongst the older towards the young. Every week, every day of my working life, I come into contact with extraordinary young people who astonish me with how respectful they are, how decent they are, how intelligent they are, how articulate they are, and yet we tend to portray the situation differently. Every week I come into contact with friends of mine who are parents, who seem to be able to manage admirably, despite all the things that are supposed to have gone wrong with parenting, to bring up marvellous people. I think we have to be very, very careful not to extrapolate from some of the things that we think might be difficult to a sense of complete decay and disintegration of society. An awful lot of the things that we've said today would have been said 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. If you're talking about tradition, I think one of the biggest mistakes we can make is think that we're somehow in a completely different moment and we've nothing to learn from it. And that means, I guess, getting back to the simple fact that we have to respect each other as people.
We recently took our son out of a primary school, largely, lots of reasons, but largely because they were very reluctant to correct mistakes, with spelling being one thing they didn't like correcting. The various reasons. The main one they gave was that they didn't want to harm self-esteem. There's also a feeling in educational thinking that spelling correctly is overrated, and I suspect that may have played a part. I think the school is a bit of possibly pretty typical, but the worry is that communicates to children a rather bad thing, which is that trying to get things right and wrong doesn't matter, and by extension that right and wrong don't matter. I don't think you can blame the riots on it, but I don't think it's a good thing.
Basically, I would like to first of all say something to the gentleman on the far right. That one. You were talking before about how teenagers, essentially, we want more space. Well, I would like to reiterate in response to that what Mr. Davenport was saying, which is we want space to make our own mistakes. We're in a culture now where it seems like everything bad is expected of us. We've got video cameras following us everywhere we go. There is constantly things on the news saying, oh yes, teenagers stabbed so-and-so, we've got a gang culture going on. And it's almost as though the government expects us to be bad citizens. Everyone else expects teenagers to be bad, and yet then at the same time they're giving us the tools, as it were, to be better.
It's incumbent on all of us, first of all, to say we have to carry on talking about this. And talking about it means, I like Carl's idea of an authentic conversation. If we don't carry on talking about this, this is an issue in which, you can already hear it in this room, positions will become more and more entrenched. And I think I like the comment from the young speaker from the back. If we spend time understanding each other, we might find that we're all closer to each other than we think.
Very briefly, I forgot this anecdote that in Germany they're introducing parents' evening at universities. Let's just hope that's one EU export that doesn't come here. But just to quickly sum up, as the strain, I disagree with Maurice saying there's just no difference, and it was the same as it was 100 years ago and 200 years ago. I mean, I know what you're saying about the panics, that's true, but there are things that have fundamentally changed. Just to give you a snapshot of the topsy-turvy nature of how adults and childhood is being confused. 16-year-olds in Scotland will be able to vote on the referendum, but adults are still not allowed to smoke in pubs, and adults are restricted on all kinds of areas. So that is new. That's not a panic. That's not something that's gone on time immemorial. There are changes, and I think the last point I'd like to say is that the erosion of adulthood and childhood and teenagers being infantilised, it doesn't do anyone any good. It harms adults, it harms children, it harms teenagers, and also, as we saw with the riots, it also does harm society as well.
Taking on from that, actually, I don't think children have become infantilised. I think they've become economic units. The lady who made the point at the top, I absolutely agree. Until we reach a point whereby, stop telling me to spend more time with my children and then telling me to work harder in the same breath. Stop telling me to manage my children's behaviour, then at the same time, put cameras on every street corner in Britain. Stop saying confusing, ridiculous, simplistic statements. And as Maurice quite rightly says, let's have an authentic conversation.
I think just as we've discussed the state, for the last hour and a half we've discussed the children and the teenagers, and the important thing is that they are individuals and that each one is different and that has different needs, just as adults are individuals and have different needs. And you can't cubbyhole the way you interact with every child in the way that you don't interact with every adult in the same way. And I think it's important that we don't see them as economic factors or units of with quantifiable well-being. I think we have to see them as people, and that's how most parents want to raise them.